of the Syrian National Army, most of which acts under the auspices of the opposition Syrian National Coalition. In addition, the northeast, as well as some neighborhoods of Aleppo city, remains under the control of the SDF, supported by the US. There have been significant hostilities in the last 2 weeks before a ceasefire was brokered between Turkey and the United States along the Euphrates River. A 5-day ceasefire has now expired, and I am seriously concerned about reports of military escalation, as well as reports of military buildups. Such an escalation could be catastrophic. Madam President, moreover, there is a new situation in the southwest. UNDOF continues to observe IDF personnel and equipment in multiple locations in the area of separation, and one location in the area of limitation in the vicinity of the Bravo line. There are media reports of Israeli advances several kilometers into Syrian territory. Israel has carried out more than 350 strikes on military facilities, equipments, and supplies across Syria since the former regime fell, and these continue, including an enormous attack in Tartus. Madam President, such attacks place a battered civilian population at further risk and undermine the prospects of an orderly political transition. We have also seen reports of the Israeli cabinet's plan to expand settlements in the Golan. Israel must cease all settlement activity in the occupied Syrian Golan, which are illegal. Attacks on Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Madam President, let me now move to the challenges that Syria faces. The first major challenge is, of course, that the conflict has not ended. Yes, we are seeing a Syria that is stable at present in many parts. Many in Damascus tells me that the law and order improved significantly after 2 initial days of instability. But stability can be fragile in many parts of Syria. And in the northeast, there are still front lines and open hostilities in which civilians are being killed, injured, and displaced. Civilians must be protected wherever they are. There must be de-escalations towards a nationwide ceasefire, as well as efforts to address tensions between military factions. The second challenge is the sheer scale of needs. Syria's economy has been ravaged by this dreadful conflict, its infrastructure destroyed, 90% of Syrians living in poverty. Let me just stress that these are enormous challenges that will require all of our support in the manner that will have to go beyond the humanitarian in terms of economic development, reconstruction, and the process to address and ultimately end sanctions. And of course, Madam President, the third challenge is, of course, political. The Syrian people have sacrificed so much so that they can determine their own future and realize their legitimate aspirations. We must ensure that the political process remains on track. Otherwise, I fear new instability. Madam President, before traveling to Damascus, I joined representatives of the Arab Contact Group on Syria, along with ministers and representatives of Bahrain, France, Germany, Qatar, Turkey, the UAE, the UK, US, and the European Union. This meeting expressed a common belief that the transitional political process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned and produce an inclusive, non-sectarian and representative government formed through a transparent process based on the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254. The Aqaba statement emphasized support for my mandate. In addition, Madam President, I think there is broad understanding that Resolution 2254 cannot, in the new circumstances, be applied mechanically. But the core principles have wide Syrian consensus. And while Resolution 2254 identified two parties, one of whom has been toppled and cannot feature in the process, it is still the case that the political transition is needed and that this will require an inclusive intra-Syrian process. Madam President, what can this look like? First, Syrians need an orderly transition that provides for preservation of state institutions that serve their interests and provide them with critical services. Here, let me take note of the efforts to ensure this already, in terms of safeguarding ministers of the former government to transfer power and calling on state employees to continue their work. This provides a strong first basis, but it is not in itself enough. Second, the transition must also be credible and inclusive, including the broader spectrum of Syrian society and Syrian parties, so that it inspires public confidence. And here let me emphasize that this is a clear desire expressed by Syrians themselves. Just as we saw significant military coordination between many groups in the recent operations, now, as we are moving forward and into a full political phase, this should be matched by inclusive political engagement. Third, there must be a new constitution in line with Resolution 2254. Fourth, there must be free and fair elections, inclusive of all Syrians, as Resolution 2254 envisages, in accordance with international standards. And Madam President, here let me say, I fully appreciate the need to ensure quick service delivery and law and order. Stability is fundamental. Competence is key too. But none of this is incompatible with a credible and inclusive political transition. It is precisely such an approach that can enable stability and indeed prevent new conflict. Madam President, I have discussed all of these elements in depth in Damascus. I met with the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, and Prime Minister of the caretaker authorities, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I also met here in Damascus with representatives of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, including armed group representatives that remain in contact with the leader, Badr Jamous. I also met with Syrian civil society and women. It was heartening to see so many of them, for years speaking across front lines, now together in their capital here in Damascus. They continue to be at the forefront of the emergency response and relief to all Syrians. Their inclusive participation is a cornerstone to sustainable peace. Madam President, concrete movement on an inclusive political transition will be key in ensuring Syria receives the economic support it needs. There is clear international willingness to engage. The needs are immense and could only be addressed with broad support, including a smooth end to sanctions, appropriate action on designations too, and full reconstruction. It is clear that the period ahead will be critical, and there are international signals that broader measures can gain traction with progress on a credible and inclusive political transition. This was an important theme in Aqaba, which stressed that Syria at last has a chance to break decades of isolation. This chance, Madam President, must be seized. Finally, let me note my meeting with Syrian women here in Damascus, as well as the engagement of my office with women across Syria and those in exile. Syrian women seek assurances that their status and rights will be respected and built upon in any transitional arrangements, with the needs of women and girls fully taken into account. Because the reality remains that Syrian women these last years have reported significant backlash. And not only this, Syrian women must be a part of the transition itself. Otherwise, it cannot be considered to be inclusive. Madam President, yesterday, I saw with my own eyes the dungeons, torture, and execution chambers of Sednaya prison. A testament to the barbarity of the fallen regimes towards its own people. I met a man released from Sednaya just 10 days ago who told me how he was tortured. An elderly woman, also recently released, said she wanted first and foremost justice. Another woman was desperately seeking clarity on the fate of her son, who was detained and whose 4 children she raised single-handedly. Of course, Syrian, UN, and other organizations have been documenting this for years, thanks to the courage of survivors and witnesses. But seeing the reality firsthand was a stark reminder of the centrality of transitional justice, the need for clarification of the fate and whereabouts of missing and disappeared persons, and ensuring due process in criminal prosecutions as a necessary safeguard against acts of revenge. Without this, Syria and Syrians will not be able to heal. And, Madam President, here let me stress an urgent first step: the protection of evidence and material, as well as sites of mass graves. We must safeguard the right of the victims and their families and survivors to both truth and justice. And we need the immediate release of all those still detained and arbitrarily across the country. Let me say that on this and across all fronts, I have been in contact with many parts of the UN system, and there is a determination across the system to strengthen the UN presence here in Syria. Madam President, Syria is for all Syrians. Now is the time for Syrians to step forward and lead. Now is the time to reassure all Syrians that their stake in the future is understood and that it will be embodied in a credible and inclusive transitional arrangements. I have made clear in Damascus my invitation to a dialogue on the Resolution 2254 and all other issues relevant to Syrians, so that we can identify a Syrian-owned and led way forwards. Madam President, of course, it is only 11 days since the fall of the former regime. My door is open, and I hope in the coming days we can build that dialogue. I understand, we all do, the massive challenges facing the authorities and the need to help concretely now. We understand the need for stability, but stability will not last long if not built on credible and inclusive foundations. The time is to build those foundations now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Thomas Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to Special Envoy Pedersen for his unflagging work, which I've had the privilege to see firsthand here in Damascus. Madam President, the pace of developments in Syria, as you've heard from Geir, over the past 3 weeks has been dramatic. What has not changed is the scale of the humanitarian crisis. Syria was already one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, with 17 million people, more than 70% of the population in need of support. More than 7 million people were displaced across the country, millions more Syrians living as refugees. Nearly 13 million people were facing acute food insecurity. The recent escalation has only added to these needs. More than 1 million people were displaced in less than 2 weeks. Hundreds of civilians killed and injured, at least 80 of them children. Health services, water supplies, already corroded by years of conflict and declining funding, were interrupted. And more than 12,000 schools were temporarily shut down, affecting millions of students. With borders, commercial routes closed, there have been shortages of bread, fuel, and other key items. Likewise, the flow of humanitarian support was severely disrupted, with most organizations temporarily suspending operations. Several warehouses have been looted. Multiple aid workers from NGOs and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent lost their lives. Thankfully, Madam President, the situation has begun to stabilize. As I've seen this week, markets, roads, health facilities are reopening. Children have gone back to school. Aid operations are gradually resuming across most of our hubs, including Aleppo, Homs, and here in Damascus. It is critical that we adapt the humanitarian response to the new, if still rapidly shifting, conditions. And that is why I'm here in Syria. First, to ensure that we are coordinated. Over the past 2 days, I've been looking closely at our systems for working together. We want to further support humanitarian leadership by drawing flexibly from the resources from across our hubs, including in Amman and Gaziantep, leveraging the strength of the system in place for Syria. We're also finding more ways to work closely with cross-border actors in northeast Syria to align efforts, but also to ensure the safety of humanitarian actors. These efforts will ensure that we have a cast iron grip of the coordination effort, as clear a picture as possible of the emerging needs across the country, and that we can direct resources in a swift and agile way using all available channels. Tomorrow, I'll travel to Aleppo, where we are already embarking on this approach. OCHA's office there is bringing together UN agency teams and NGOs previously working in areas formerly controlled by the Assad government, with those working on the cross-border response. I then plan to visit Idlib, where humanitarian needs are among the most severe. As the situation evolves and following my visit, we will also swiftly issue an overview of critical funding needs for the next 3 months. Madam President, the second reason for my visit is to ensure that the humanitarian community has the best possible conditions in which to work. While here in Damascus, I've met with representatives of the new caretaker government, including the commander of the new administration, Mr. Ahmed al-Shara, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir. I have been encouraged by these discussions, and I'm pleased to report that they have committed to what will be an ambitious scaling up of vital humanitarian support. We have received assurances that they will facilitate the movement of aid personnel and supplies from neighboring countries, including from Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, for as long as humanitarian operations are required. Again, this includes routes into areas controlled by other parties in the northeast. The intensification of conflict between actors in northeast Syria and its potential humanitarian fallout is a case for concern and warrants urgent attention and efforts for de-escalation. We also received assurances that access to people in need will be facilitated wherever they are in Syria, including across lines of conflict and into the northeast. We received commitments on the issuance of visas, work permits for aid workers, and NGO registration documents. The resident and humanitarian coordinator and authorities are developing a set of guidelines on this. And we received commitments on protecting and respecting the principled nature of humanitarian operations. This includes the conduct of independent needs assessments and selection of beneficiaries, the ability to choose our own partners, including those who have been working in government-held areas and those currently working in the northeast, and assurances that there will not be restrictions on employing women who are absolutely essential to our mission. Absolutely essential. These commitments alone will not relieve people's suffering, but they are an essential basis for us to scale up operations. Madam President, the third reason for my visit is to ensure that I can make concrete requests of the international community, including the Security Council. So from you, we need three things. First, strong, unequivocal messaging that international humanitarian law must be respected, both in any ongoing hostilities and in meeting people's basic needs. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Those on the move must be allowed to do so safely. The missing must be accounted for. And where hostilities have ended, landmines and explosive remnants of war must be removed. And, as the authorities agreed, unhindered humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are, must be facilitated. A second request, we need more money. I recognize the generosity of donors for the Syria crisis over the years. Since 2016, more than $38 billion has gone to the UN-coordinated appeals for Syria and for the regional refugee response. But this year's humanitarian appeal, the largest country appeal in the world right now, is also one of the most poorly supported. With just 2 weeks left in 2024, it is less than a third funded, the largest ever funding gap for the Syria response. Now is the time to invest in the Syrian people, to support flexible funds so that we can respond to changing needs. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund has already allocated $32 million to Syria this year. Now is also the time for member states to work on development support to rebuilding Syria, reducing dependence on humanitarian support and maintaining essential services. A third request, we need all states to facilitate the humanitarian effort, including by ensuring that sanctions and counterterrorism measures do not impede humanitarian operations. I will travel next to Ankara to discuss the crisis with the government of Turkey. Turkey's facilitation of cross-border humanitarian operations in Syria for many years has been a lifeline. I will also be discussing the crisis with authorities in Lebanon and Jordan, who have been such generous hosts of Syrian refugees. Madam President, when war erupted in Syria 13 years ago, I was in Lebanon, just the short drive away that I took yesterday. And neither I nor anyone could have imagined then the full extent of the suffering the people of Syria would endure for more than a decade. The world let them down. We let them down. But there is now, as the Secretary General has said, an historic opportunity to put that right and support the Syrian people, especially women and girls, in their hope for a more peaceful future. I pay tribute to the Syrian people for their patience, but they have waited too long. Giving them this support now will take patience, creativity, and determination. The progress we make will be inconsistent, and the risks of failure great. But this should be a galvanizing project for the UN and for the humanitarian movement. And so, at a moment of hope and peril, we must rise to the challenge and back the people of Syria. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Wad Al-Khatib.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the United Nations Security Council. On the 8th of December, millions of Syrians scattered across the world in refugee camps, in exile, or inside our homeland, held their breath as we watched the news. It was a moment we sacrificed everything for, a moment of joy, but also one of deep grief, a chapter in Syria's history that will forever remain bittersweet. For the first time, Syrian activists began announcing their real names, reclaiming the identity they hid for years out of fear. Groups from the early days of the revolution began to reactivate, inspired to think about their role in the Syria future. It was a moment of victory, born from years of unimaginable suffering. It's ironic how 8 years ago, this very week, I was forcibly displaced out of my city, Aleppo. I carried my 1-year-old daughter in one arm, my unborn baby in my womb, and my hard drives hidden beneath my clothes, containing the truth of our struggle. I didn't know if we would survive, but I held on one truth. The evidence of our suffering would remain even if I didn't make it. Since that day, many countries told us to accept the new reality, that they have normalized with Assad, a man whose regime killed our beloved ones, destroyed our homes, and turned our dreams to dust. I refused to believe it, but I began preparing myself for a life where I would never see a free Syria. Every day, I whispered to myself, if not for me, then for my daughters to see. When I made my film for Sama, I traveled the world sharing our story. Over and over, leaders, politicians, and diplomats said to me, we wish we have done more. We should have done more. Today, I stand here to tell you, you can do more. Yes, history repeats itself, but it rarely gives us the chance to correct our mistakes. This is your chance today. The fall of Assad regime did not happen in 11 days or through one recent battle. It happened because of the countless sacrifices, struggles, and the losses of the Syrian people. It happens because 13 million Syrians were forced from their homes, hundreds of thousands drowned at sea. Countless others died in bombed schools and hospitals, and hundreds of thousands were detained, tortured, and forcibly disappeared. It happened when the Syrian people lost everything except their voices, their courage, and their hope. It was not announced with the military victories or grand declaration. It was civilians. 2 young men rode on a motorbike into an empty tank in Umayya Square. 4 women blasted Abdelbasit Sarut song, Thuri Thuri Dara, a prize Dara, in their car, waving to a future they had not yet seen. These were ordinary people, civilians, not soldiers, not even activists, declaring the fall of a tyrant. But this moment is not the end of our struggle. It's only the beginning of a new chapter. We ask this Council to act in line within Resolution 2254 and help us to achieve a real political transition, one that includes all Syrians from all regions and also the diaspora. The transition must lead to a new constitution and free, fair election. It must adhere to international standards of transparency, justice, and accountability. But this transition cannot happen without justice. The Assad regime has turned Syria into a theater of unimaginable crimes. Families have been searching for their beloved ones for over a decade. In recent days, the release of detainees from Sednaya was a tragic reminder of this brutality. Heartbreaking videos of chaos outside prisons filled our screens, families desperately searching for loved ones, while documents burned and records were destroyed forever. The regime cruelty was not just about detention. It was about erasing lives, silencing truth, and leaving families in endless uncertainty. Wafa Mustafa, my dear friend, whose father was detained in 2013 and whose fate is still unknown until today, asks a question that broke us all from our hearts. Where was the UN? Where was the ICRC in those critical days? Why am I supposed to identify my father's body on Instagram? Why are we seeing documents and IDs scattered on the ground, these precious pieces of evidence of our beloved ones? They could hold the only truth about what happened to them, and yet we are being denied even that. Madam President, the international community must act. Families for loved ones deserve access to the truth, access to every prison, to every mass grave, to every part of justice. The bombing must be stopped. Israel's recent strikes are a blatant breach of international law. They must be held accountable for that. The protection of civilians is vital. In northeast Syria, violence and instability continues to devastate lives. A unified, coordinated approach is urgently needed to build a safe, stable future for all Syrians. And do not forget also the millions of Syrian refugees all over the world. Their future remains frozen, their dignity denied. These are not numbers. They are families, mothers, fathers, and children who deserve stability and the chance to rebuild their lives. Madam President, for too long, Syria have been left to bleed while the world debated and hesitated. For too long, we have been waiting for action. The time for excuses is over, and this is the time for action. We, the Syrian people, have shown the world our resilience, our courage, and unwavering belief in freedom. I'm asking you to stand with us, to support our demand for justice and accountability, and to help us build a political transition that reflects the dream and sacrifice of all Syrians. And to my fellow Syrians, whether in camps, in exile, or still holding on inside our homeland, we carry today a great responsibility. The sacrifices of the past 14 years have brought us to this moment. We must rise together, united, to rebuild our country with justice, dignity, and freedom for all. This is our chance, and we cannot let it split away. To all oppressed people around the world, to political prisoners, to the displaced, and to the refugees, hope lives in every voice that refuses to be silent, in every heart that refuses to give up. Hold on, because the freedom is coming, and it belongs to us all. As I end, I want to pay tribute to all those who sacrificed their lives so we could see this day. We carry their memory, their courage, and their dreams with us. Today, as the UN Security Council holds its first briefing after Syria freedom, Syria without Assad, we take our first steps into a new future, and this is only the beginning. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Al-Khatib for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Sabater Jamus.
At the outset, I pay tribute to the souls of the martyrs of Syria who died for the sake of Syria. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Council, I stand before you today on behalf of the great Syrian people to express our pride of this historic day when the sun of freedom rose over Syria. on the 8th of December, or the 8th of December, represents the triumph of the will of the Syrian people, which compelled the authoritarian regime to flee Damascus. This day will remain immortalized in the memory of the Syrians. We had warned yet time and again that the patience of the Syrian people, which was committed to a negotiated peaceful settlement, will not last forever. Unfortunately, the Syrians lost their trust in the ability of the international community and the United Nations to protect the humanitarian principles and to do justice to peoples seeking justice. For 13 years, the Syrian opposition, represented by the negotiations commissions, spared no effort and showed maximum flexibility to ensure a peaceful political transition. But the authoritarian regime remained the main obstacle, ignored all the initiatives launched by 4 international envoys, while the Syrians paid with their blood and lives a very high price. Syrians were displaced all over the world. They were turned into refugees looking for security and dignity. The opposition took upon itself to meet the aspirations of the Syrian people towards the state of law, freedom, justice, and citizenship. Our battle was not only with the regime, but with regional and international polarizations, which made our mission even more difficult. Despite all that, we never stopped struggling, despite the difficult questions that were asked. Where is the political solution, and where is the implementation of Resolution 2254? Today, after the fall of the regime, the world bears witness to the scope of the crimes and violations perpetrated by the regime against our people. Prisons and detention centers have revealed brutal horrors that will remain a stain on the human conscience. From this rostrum, we reaffirm that we will prosecute this regime and its fugitive president, and we will spare no effort to secure justice and to do justice to the victims. Transitional justice and accountability are not a choice, they are an imperative to make sure that these crimes are not repeated. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, we value the efforts made by the current administration and its president, Ahmed al-Shara, and the caretaker prime minister to restore security and provide services to citizens. We reaffirm that we are ready to work together to build a new Syria, a state where all citizens are equal in rights and obligations, a state free from foreign interventions, which builds balanced relations with its neighbors and friends. This victory wouldn't have been achieved if it weren't for the sacrifices of all the Syrians, the martyrs who sacrificed their life for freedom, the detainees who languished in dark cells of injustice, the refugees who suffered for long years in camps, the rebels who faced death to free their nation, the journalists who conveyed the voice of the truth, politicians who fought in international instances, the civil society which created practical solutions despite challenges, and legal professionals who prosecuted crimes, the Syrian women who were symbols of resilience and determination, and the Syrian youth which invested in its education to build a bright future for Syria. We would also like to convey our heartfelt thanks to the countries which stood by us until the last moment, which supported us and believed that the Syrian people is capable of change and will not succumb until they achieve their freedom. These states were an essential partner in supporting our right to freedom and dignity, and we will never forget their brave stance. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the authoritarian regime left Syria in a state of economic devastation. 80% of the people live below the poverty line. It is time to lift the economic sanctions imposed on the Syrian state and to increase humanitarian and relief support to allow us to rebuild our country. Despite the changes in Syria, despite these changes in Syria, we still believe that the that Resolution 2254 is the roadmap to meet the aspirations of our people. It is true that the circumstances have changed and that the regime, which was party to this resolution, has collapsed. But the spirit and the essence of the resolution, which aims at allowing the people to govern itself through fair elections under the supervision of the UN, this resolution is still the principle based on which we work. So we need to initiate a dialogue in Damascus under the auspices of the UN. Therefore, we call for establishing an inclusive transitional national government that represents all the segments of the Syrian people, which includes the rebels, politicians, and civil society, all the components of the Syrian people, and guarantees the representation of women and youth. Second, there is a need to organize an inclusive national conference organized by the transitional government to choose a constituent assembly that brings together wise men, experts, scientists, politicians, statesmen, and community leaders, as well as veterans and the youth, and this assembly will be entrusted with elaborating a new constitution that reflects the aspirations of Syrian men and women. 3, organize a referendum on the new constitution and organize fair, free elections in an impartial, safe environment under the supervision of the United Nations. We also emphasize the need to take the following measures: creating a fund to support the detainees that were released, to secure their needs and to reintegrate them in society after years of suffering, to establish a fund to support the families of the martyrs of the revolution who died under torture in the barbaric detention centers or during the war waged by the regime against innocent civilians, to honor their sacrifices and to compensate their families. And this is the least we can do in view of the horrifying facts that you are seeing on screens, whether inside Naya or elsewhere, or the mass graves that are being discovered every day. 4, to secure the return of the regime defectors and those who were unfairly dismissed from their services and to disperse their financial dues. They have paid everything they had to stand by their people and their country. To create a fund to support the refugees and the displaced who desire to return to Syria, to guarantee their needs and to secure their safe and dignified return. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, we are determined to build the new Syria, a state of law, of justice, and of democracy, a republic that belongs to these times, that protects all its citizens without discrimination, and which remains united in its land and its people. The Syria of the future will be a model of a modern state governed by its people and their free will. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Jamous for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I too would like to begin by thanking the Under-Secretary General and Director of OCHA, Tom Fletcher, and the Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, for their briefings, but also for their precious work over the last few days, including in Syria. I also thank Mr. Badr Jamous, Chairman of the Syrian Negotiating Committee, for his statement, and I thank Ms. Wad Al-Khatib, co-founder of the Action for Sama Foundation, for sharing her story with us. In the space of just a few weeks, a new chapter has opened in Syria. The Syrians are facing a colossal and formidable task. They must ensure that justice is done for the darkest pages of the previous chapter and write a new history. And I'd like to join in the condolences for all Syrian families, for all of the sufferings that they have endured. It's high time now to be able to write a new page of history. Switzerland will continue to support their quest for freedom and justice, dialogue and reconciliation, the enhancement of their plural identity, and the rebuilding of their nation on the foundations of the rule of law. During its 2-year term on the Security Council, Switzerland has reiterated that only an inclusive political solution led by and for the Syrians, facilitated by the UN and its special envoy, and based on international law, can put an end to the conflict. The emerging authorities in Syria now have an historic opportunity to clearly distinguish themselves from their predecessors by supporting an inclusive and sustainable political transition in line with the main elements of Resolution 2254. These elements include a national ceasefire, which must also be observed by all parties to the conflict, starting with Syria's neighbours. Respect for the United Nations Charter, international humanitarian law and human rights, including the protection of minorities, as well as Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence and territorial integrity. Inclusive governance, with the active participation, above all, of women and civil society, whose essential role Switzerland has constantly promoted. Rejection of all forms of terrorism. Consideration of the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people in all their diversity, and the holding of free, inclusive, and transparent and fair elections. Switzerland is also deeply concerned by the latest developments in the occupied Syrian Golan. It calls for any violation of the 1974 Agreement on the Disengagement of Forces to cease immediately, and reiterates its support for UNDOF. Switzerland recalls that the Golan Heights constitute occupied territory. It condemns the Israeli government's announcements that it intends to double the number of settlements there, which are illegal under international humanitarian law. Madam President, Switzerland will continue to make Geneva available for all peace talks and initiatives under the aegis of the UN and its special envoy. But Geneva is also home to 2 key institutions for the transition. The recent release of many detainees in Syria has confirmed the scale of the atrocities committed in the Syrian government's infamous prisons. But it has also brought a glimmer of hope to families still waiting for news of their loved ones. The right to know of these relatives is a rule firmly anchored in the Geneva Conventions. The independent institution for missing persons, whose mandate is strictly humanitarian, is well placed to shed light on the fate of tens of thousands of missing persons throughout the country, in cooperation with associations of victims' families and other humanitarian actors. Finally, Switzerland reiterates that there can be no lasting peace without justice according to the principles of the rule of law. Evidence, as established in particular by archives and the accounts of victims and witnesses, which can support the judicial authorities in rendering accounts, must be preserved. Switzerland stresses the central role of the international, impartial and independent mechanism in this respect. Madam President, over the past 2 years, Switzerland has played the role of spokesperson on humanitarian issues in Syria. During its mandate, and in particular after the terrible earthquakes of February 2023, it has been committed to ensuring that humanitarian aid reaches all those in need safely, quickly, and without hindrance, using every possible means of delivery and covering the whole of Syria. We underline the importance of humanitarian exemptions from sanctions to facilitate humanitarian activities, particularly in the areas of health, education, and food security. We will continue to encourage reflection on this subject in the light of the changes at the head of the country. The crises that have been intertwined over the last 13 years have claimed more than 500,000 lives, destroyed critical infrastructure, pushed more than 90% of the population below the poverty line, and displaced more than 16 million people. Millions of refugees are now contemplating a return that can only be voluntary, safe, and dignified, in accordance with international law for the protection of refugees and human rights in general. Switzerland reiterates its solidarity with the Syrian people. With this in mind, we have just allocated a further 2 million Swiss francs for emergency aid in Syria. We welcome the visit to Syria by the Under-Secretary General and Director of OCHA, Tom Fletcher. He reported on the commitments made by the emerging authorities to protect civilians, to continue essential services, and to open all border crossings for humanitarian aid. These commitments must be put into practice and maintained over time. Madam President, while leaving the Council, Switzerland calls on all its members to pursue the path opened up on the 8th of December and in the same spirit of cooperation, and to fully support a political transition led by and for the Syrians. The search for a political solution in Syria in the terms adopted by our Council has stalled for too long. It is time for unequivocal support for peace and security in Syria and in the region as a whole. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we would like to thank the Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and the Emergency Relief Coordinator Thomas Fletcher for their briefings. We also heard the assessment by the chair of the Syrian Negotiations Committee, Mr. Badr Jamous, and the representative of the civil society, Ouad El-Khatib. We follow very closely the developing situation in the brotherly country of Syria, which has entered a new transitional period of its history after the major part of its territory came under the control of the alliance of armed groups. It is clear that predicting today the outcome and the political, socio-economic ramifications of developments in this country, of the major tectonic shifts there, is not something anyone can do. We are all hoping for the best. But I would like to underscore that the Russian Federation has always been on the side of the brotherly people of Syria. We have always extended and we will continue providing them with the needed support. It is the Syrian people, in all of its ethnic and religious diversity, has to decide the future of Syria, which currently is quite uncertain given the internal lack of stability, which is fraught with palpable threats to its sovereignty and statehood. The territorial integrity of this country is more vulnerable now than ever. There's a real risk of its becoming a number of cantons broken down by ethnic and religious characteristics. The Syrians today have made the utmost efforts to make sure there is an inclusive national dialogue without separating people into losers and winners. This is a very serious and difficult task, and the international community has to do utmost to help this along. There's an equally serious threat for the Syrians, which lies in the actions by Israel, who, using the artificial pretext of self-defense and protecting their security, essentially is deploying a full-scale operation to destroy the defense potential of the country. The Air Force of Israel, and they used to also conduct arbitrary airstrikes in the past, but as of the 8th of December, they have conducted more than 500 airstrikes. As a result, the Navy of Syria was destroyed, 90% of air defense and missile defense, and half of Syrian Air Force. Additionally, there are mass bombardments of government buildings and dozens of industrial and storage facilities in Damascus, Suwayda, Deraa, Homs, Tartus, Latakia, and Palmyra. Idlib, Atanf, and areas across the Euphrates are obviously outside of this equation. In the early hours of the 14th of December, the Air Force of Israel struck objects in the city of Qasyun and destroyed an electronic warfare station. There is also the land incursion by the Israeli forces in the occupied Syrian Golans, with this gross violation of the provisions of the disengagement agreement of 1974 and an open attempt on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a neighbor. According to our information, the Israeli forces are not just occupying the Syrian side of the separation line. They've moved much further. Israeli military equipment was seen almost 20 kilometers away from Damascus. The argument that the peacekeepers need to be protected sounds very cynical, given that the peacekeepers currently are essentially very deep behind Israeli lines. The capacity to effectively defend one's borders being attacked by Israel now is one of the basic factors of Syrian sovereignty. And we advocate that we call a spade and do not sweep under the carpet facts when they're inconvenient for West Jerusalem. If Israel wants to have good relations with neighbors, if Israel wants that, then they need to build this not from the position of force, but on an equal and mutually beneficial basis. Distinguished colleagues, one of the main tasks currently for us is safeguarding Syrian state institutions and making sure they function so as to provide everyday assistance to Syrians. It's important to make sure that the rules of basic law have primacy, that the civilians are protected, including the vulnerable categories, that there is civilian peace, national reconciliation, and to prevent vandalism, violence, and bloodshed. In this context, we note the statements made by the de facto authorities in Syria when they say that they intend to facilitate the work of government institutions, maintain law and security, suppress criminal acts, prevent extrajudicial justice. We trust that these approaches will be supported by all interested Syrian parties. We would like to emphasize separately that Syria was a territory where for centuries Muslims and Christians lived together. Damascus is a residency of the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch and all of the East, John X. He is the head of the Antioch Church, which has a sisterly interaction with the Russian Orthodox Church. And we hope that Syria will continue being the homeland for all of its citizens, regardless of their religion. We are convinced that the pathway towards normalization in Syria is in inclusive inter-Syrian dialogue, taking into account the interest of all religious and ethnic groups of the society when they're aimed at attaining national harmony, comprehensive settlement process, and doing this in line with the basic principles in Security Council Resolutions 2254. We support efforts made by Geir Pedersen to have a national de-escalation in organizing a political process and doing this with the mediation and support from the UN. We remain convinced that there is a need to consolidate approaches by main international players aimed at creating conditions conducive towards stabilization of the situation. It is our view that the Special Envoy should play a leading role in coordinating this work. And in this context, we welcome your initiative, Gary, to convene an international conference on Syria and call upon all interested parties to support implementing this idea. When there are such dramatic changes in Syria, we think it would be premature to come up with optimistic forecasts or talk seriously about the improved humanitarian situation of the Syrians. We would like to see Syria prosper as well, but so far Syrians are still encountering a deep humanitarian crisis. 90% of people live in poverty. 70% of people need urgent food assistance. Inflation spikes and currency devaluation because of recent events aggravated the socioeconomic situation of Syrians. In some parts of Syria, bread prices have grown up by 900% since 27th of November. The disruption of logistics supply lines and the closure of borders means that there are fewer resources and lack of the means of sustenance. There's an acute issue having to do with the displaced persons. There's a trend for the refugees to come back, but there's also an outflow of people from the country. Since the moment of the increase in hostilities, more than 1 million people had to leave their homes. Most of these people are women and children, and there are very difficult conditions now within the country and outside of it. We also should remember those who recently fled Lebanon into Syria because of Israeli bombings. They need to be helped, and at the very least, they need to have their security ensured. Madam President, we are concerned by the news according to which the humanitarian activity is seriously limited. Humanitarians are telling us about the security issues, power cuts, and instances of looting. In Damascus, for example, humanitarian assistance warehouses have been looted. At the same time, we support the intent of humanitarian UN agency to continue being on the ground and continue providing assistance. The humanitarian crisis in Syria, which reached a catastrophic level, is something that demands urgent and coordinated action on the behalf of the entire international community. Unfortunately, the humanitarian appeal on Syria is underfunded. It has only received 1/3 of the funding, 32%. In this regard, we would like to address the so-called traditional donors and ask them a question. Are you going to be guided by the principles of humanity and impartiality when it comes to the Syrian humanitarian file? Or will you, as before, continue the practice of suffocating the Syrian people through sanctions? Sanctions need to be lifted because they, as we've always said, impact the everyday people. For our part, we will continue extending the assistance to the brotherly people of Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for the information provided. But in particular, we thank them for the valuable work that they're doing in this complex scenario. And I listened closely to Ms. Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamous, and we also thank them for their statements. I express the solidarity of Ecuador with the Syrian people and with its aspiration for a true future of peace and development. The current scenario is an opportunity to restore the rule of law, to encourage national reconciliation, and to provide the Syrian people with the conditions for well-being and security that were unavailable to them over the last 13 years. Ecuador concurs with the words of the Secretary-General on the need to restore the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. Further, we support UNDOF's mandate, and we reiterate our position that we do not recognize the annexation of territory by force. We commend the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen to support and assist with a process of a comprehensive and participatory political transition based on the principles of Resolution 2254, which should be respected in line with what was mentioned by Special Envoy Pedersen. Over the last 2 years, we have insisted on the need to ensure that international humanitarian law is complied with and the need to favour an inclusive, participatory, Syrian-led political dialogue with the support of the region, the United Nations, and the international community as a whole. This position remains unchanged. Turning this possibility for dialogue into a tangible, sustainable reality based on genuine concern for the Syrian population is an ethical imperative. Madam President, the conflict in Syria has had devastating consequences on the civilian population. 70% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. There are 7 million IDPs. 500,000 children are facing severe malnutrition. These figures speak to the parlous conditions in the country and the urgent need to improve them. All cross-line and cross-border modalities for the access of humanitarian assistance must remain operational to guarantee the predictability and sustainability of humanitarian assistance, adapting it to the new reality. Hostilities must end to enable the reopening of the more than 12,000 shuttered schools, the rehabilitation of the health and protection systems, and the rebuilding of the civilian infrastructure that was decommissioned as a result of the conflict. Ecuador appeals to the Syrian transition authorities to, in the current circumstances in the country, take the necessary steps to prevent non-state actors from accessing and using weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical weapons, pursuant to the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. Madam President, colleagues, today more than ever, it is vital to facilitate the population's access to transparent accountability mechanisms and to step up efforts to gather information on the fate of more than 100,000 missing persons. At the end of our term on the Security Council, the situation has changed in an unexpected manner. And in this complex context, we support the prioritization of a true good faith dialogue, and we hope that the channels of communication and assistance from the international community will remain open to support Syria in rebuilding its social fabric, in establishing plural institutions, and restoring peace and security in Syria and the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the members of the A3+, namely Guyana, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the A3+ would like to thank Mr. Peterson and Mr. Fletcher for their valuable briefings. We listened carefully to the representatives of the civil society. Madam President, our meeting takes place in a unique context. Syria. Syria, a nation exhausted by conflict, could choose the long road to peace. This situation brings immense hope for Syrians. However, it also causes significant concern as the fragile calm of recent days risk being disrupted, plunging Syria into a renewed crisis that no one wishes to see. The A3+ firmly believes that the time has come for a genuine Syrian-led and a Syrian-owned political process under the auspices of the United Nations for a new Syria that unites all Syrians. Yes, all Syrians, regardless of ethnicity or religious denominations. All Syrians, including women and young people, should be fully and meaningfully engaged in this political process. The involvement of the civil society is also key to ensuring a successful transition in Syria towards the realization of the aspirations of the Syrian people. In this regard, we fully support the efforts of the Special Envoy and urge the meaningful implementation of Resolution 2254, including the establishment of an inclusive transitional governing body with full executive power. We also stress the critical role of the United Nations at this juncture, underscoring that the Syrian people should be able to rely on the organization's support and expertise as they navigate the path ahead toward building a strong, sustainable culture of good governance. It is time for inclusivity, not division. It is time for inclusivity, not division. It is time for dialogue, not arms. It is time for dialogue, not arms. The A3+ reaffirms its unwavering commitment to Syria's sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. We firmly reject any attempt to divide Syria. to move forward from its history of violence. Syria should not be an arena of polarization or rivalry of external powers. The A3 Plus stresses that only the Syrian people will freely decide the future of Syria. This fragile situation must not be exploited for the resurgence of terrorism. And in this context, decisive and collaborative action is therefore required. Furthermore, the A3 Plus reiterate that Syria's territorial integrity must be respected by all. And in this regard, we express our grave concern over the recent military incursions by the Israeli Defense Forces into Syrian territory, which constitute a flagrant violation of international law, a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. We emphasize the critical role of UNDOF in maintaining peace and stability in the region. And we also reject any unilateral actions undermining its mandate and its missions. The A3 Plus reaffirms the UN resolution related to the Golan Heights, underscoring that the Golan is a Syrian territory under occupation. And we call for full respect of the 1974 disengagement agreement, including the status of the area of separation. And we urge all parties to comply with their obligation in this regard. Madam President, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains dire, representing one of the most pressing challenges for the international community. Nearly 17 million people are now in need of assistance. And the latest developments have exacerbated the situation, with over 1 million people displaced in recent days. The A3 Plus express grave concern over these developments, and we call for broad mobilization to enable humanitarian actors to address the urgent needs of the population. Continued fighting, particularly in the northeast, will only worsen the humanitarian situation. We urge all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, including those related to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call for an immediate nationwide ceasefire, to ensure freedom of movement for humanitarian actors. Unhindered humanitarian access must be guaranteed through all available mechanisms, including cross-border operations, to provide essential assistance to those in need. The A3 Plus calls upon donors to mobilize adequate funding for the humanitarian response plan in Syria. Increasing needs demand more resources. The Syrian people must not be abandoned. And we stress that the return of displaced Syrians to their home must be voluntary, must be safe, must be dignified. No one should be forced to return. Conditions must be created in Syria through early recovery and reconstruction to facilitate this process. Madam President, the latest developments in Syria have shown that unresolved crises do not simply fade away. They re-emerge. If a comprehensive and inclusive solution is not found for the situation in Syria, the repercussion will be disastrous for the region. For the A3+, it is the responsibility of the international community to stand with the Syrian people and help them build a brighter future for their countries. The international community should not repeat the mistakes made elsewhere in the region. The international community, I repeat, should not repeat the mistakes made elsewhere in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Wad Al-Khatib and Mr. Madar Jamas for their words. Since November 27th, we have witnessed rapid and dramatic changes in the state of affairs in Syria. Though it is premature to use concrete terms in relation to the de facto authority, we take note the current caretaker government has expressed its will for a smooth and peaceful transfer of power. In this regard, we appreciate the efforts made by Special Envoy Pedersen, including through meeting with Mr. Ahmed al-Sharara, Mr. Mohammed al-Bashir in Damascus, and other relevant counterparts. Japan is committed to backing the efforts of Syrian people to realize a political transition process in the spirit of the principles of the Security Council Resolution 2254, which leads to credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian governance. The future government must ensure respect for the rule of law and human rights, including women's rights. It also needs to provide protection to all Syrians, including religious and ethnic minorities. Madam President, there has been a success of reports of tragic traces of the atrocities committed by Assad regime, including torture in the detention centers such as Sednaya. The former regime must be held accountable for its crimes, and justice must be served. As the Special Envoy said, providing immediate and necessary support to the victims and their families is urgent. We uphold the roles of relevant bodies in this regard to shed light on what has happened and is happening in order to restore the dignity of detainees and determine the fates of the missing. Furthermore, we emphasize the importance of continuing our efforts with the OPCW and other partners to secure, declare, and destroy Syria's remaining chemical weapons stockpiles. We must prevent terrorists and extreme groups from acquiring any weapons of mass destruction. We must not forget those who are suffering as a result of nearly 14-year civil war. More than 70% of the population still needs humanitarian assistance, and the current upheaval has only increased this need. We understand that in some border areas, the movement of refugees returning to Syria has been observed. The authority must ensure conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns of all those who were forced to flee the country. Madam President, Japan is concerned about the development of Israeli forces beyond the area of separation in the Golan Heights. Even though the Israeli government has stated the move is temporary and defensive measure, we believe that further explanation is required as to grounds for these military actions, including how they could be justified in relation to the 1974 disengagement agreement. Also, we are concerned about the recent announcement by the Israeli government to expand settlements in the Golan Heights, of which the government of Japan does not recognize the annexation by Israel. And such settlement activities are a violation of international law. Japan urges Israel to avoid any actions that would deteriorate the situation. The door to a new era is beginning to open. Beyond, there is a need to build a new nation that is open and truly a land of peace for the Syrian people. We cannot accept the occurrence of a new round of oppression, violence, or tragedy. The future of Syria should be determined by the Syrian people themselves. We stand with the people of Syria. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I would like to first of all thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Pierre Kedrison, and the Under Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I would like to also thank Mr. Badr Jamous and Ms. Wad Al-Kateb for their description of the current situation and their testimony. Madam President, a new historic phase is opening for Syria and the Syrian people, as happened after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime. After years of brutal repression, of suffering, and deep fracturing, the time has come for reconciliation and reconstruction in Syria. And also the time for justice for the thousands of men, women, and children victims of the regime. These 13 years of civil war left the country battered, and their needs are immense. A major part of the population had to go into exile far away from their homes. The economy is to be restored, and the country is to be rebuilt. In the immediate perspective, the priority has to be a cessation of hostilities throughout the country. The cycle of violence has to be broken. All of the civilians, including the ethnic and religious minorities, have to be protected in line with the international law and human rights law. The international humanitarian law has to be upheld. We took note of the initial statements, encouraging ones, made by the de facto authorities in this regard. France has very high expectations on this topic. I will judge them on their acts and over time. Humanitarian assistance has to finally be supplied to all of the people who need it in Syria and throughout its territory. Madam President, at the same time, an orderly political transition has to be started, a kind of that represents all of the trends of Syrian opposition and the de facto authorities. This is to be done guided by the spirit of Resolution 2254 and the major principles contained therein, whilst safeguarding the state institutions. The United Nations, through its Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, can greatly help this process along. All of the components of the Syrian society has to be found at the same table so as to discuss the future of their country. We're launching a political process which has to be led by the Syrians themselves. The women and the young people should allow the building of the kind of future which meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people in all of their diversity. And this means coming up with guarantees in terms of human rights and fighting impunity, in particular when it comes to the disappeared, the tortured, or those who were arbitrarily detained under the Assad regime. Madam President, it will also be of fundamental importance for the new Syria to make sure that there is no resurgence of extremism and terrorism. And against these phenomena, the fighting has to continue, including fighting Daesh. The greatest kind of vigilance also has to be maintained when it comes to the proliferation of weapons, in particular those which were within the Syrian chemical program. The fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime provides a historic opportunity to destroy these chemical weapons. And the de facto authorities have to take up this issue and cooperate with OPCW. Within the framework of this process, France is ready to continue helping the Syrian people when the humanitarian needs are so high. In the short-term perspective, it's vital to make sure that humanitarian assistance arrives safely to all of the Syrians and using all possible supply routes. And finally, let me say that we follow with concern the developments in the Golan. We call on Israel to withdraw from the area and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, and to fully uphold the agreement on disengagement of 1974. It has to be upheld by the signatories, Israel and Syria. And we renew our full support to UNDOF, whose security must be preserved. Madam President, for 13 years now, France has stood by the Syrian people as they fought for freedom and against barbarism. I will continue supporting the Syrian political process, and this process will have a central role to play in the political transition in Damascus. France will continue standing by the Syrian people during this period of hope opening up in front of them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and USG Fletcher for their briefings. I've also listened attentively to the statements of other briefers. Recently, the situation in Syria has undergone drastic changes, to which China pays great attention. China has long pursued a policy of friendship and cooperation with Syria, not interfering in Syria's internal affairs and respecting the choice of the Syrian people. We sincerely hope that Syria will achieve peace and restore stability as soon as possible, and we're ready to play a constructive role to that end. I wish to share the following 4 points. First, it's imperative to stabilize the security situation. We call on all parties concerned in Syria to exercise calm and restraint, refrain from actions that may escalate the situation, and prevent new conflicts. All parties are obliged to take measures to prohibit attacks against civilians and to protect the security of diplomatic missions and foreign nationals. We hope that Syria's state institutions will remain operational to create conditions for the restoration of social order, and we hope that influential countries, especially regional countries, will play a constructive role in stabilizing the situation in Syria. We express our grave concern over Israel's recent continued airstrikes against Syria and its entry into the Golan region, as well as its claim to expand settlements in the Golan. We call on Israel to stop these actions. Second, the long-term solution is to promote a political settlement. China supports Syria in implementing Security Council Resolution 2254, advancing its domestic political process in line with the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned principle, and finding a national reconstruction plan through inclusive dialogue. The international community should effectively safeguard Syria's independence, unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, respect Syria's ethnic and religious traditions, and allow the Syrian people to make their own decisions. The will of the Syrian people should be respected to avoid national division and the fragmentation of the domestic situation. China supports the active mediation role of the UN and supports the work of Special Envoy Pedersen in facilitating dialogue between all parties and reaching an arrangement that accommodates the interests of all sides. Third, the clear bottom line is the fight against terrorism. Terrorism, a common enemy of mankind, poses a severe threat to international peace and security. The Syria of the future should stand firm against any form of terrorism and extremist forces. The Syrian territory must not be used to support terrorism or threaten the security of other countries. On counterterrorism, states have an obligation to combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council, including the ETIM or TIP. The international community should draw full lessons and refrain from double standards and selective application. Fourth, it's incumbent on all parties to alleviate the humanitarian situation. The drastic changes in the situation in Syria have exacerbated the already dire humanitarian situation. China appreciates the efforts made by UN agencies to resume humanitarian operations in Syria and calls on all parties to fulfill their obligations under IHL, ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, and facilitate the humanitarian operations of UN agencies. The international community should lend a helping hand to Syria to help improve its humanitarian situation. The protracted, unlawful unilateral sanctions imposed on Syria by some countries, which have severely hampered its economic and social development and caused tremendous harm to the Syrian people, should be lifted immediately. President, for more than a year since the outbreak of the Gaza conflict, the Middle East has witnessed relentless turmoil. Tensions have escalated in the Palestinian-Israeli, Lebanese-Israeli, Iraqi-Israeli, and Red Sea situations, coupled with the recent shift in the situation in Syria. The Middle East region is mired in constant turbulence and frequent conflicts, gravely affecting international peace and security. Such a situation, if left unchecked, will only drag more countries and peoples into the quagmire of war. The international community should work with a greater sense of urgency and responsibility to seek de-escalation of conflicts and promote the early return of peace and stability to the region. To that end, China supports the Council in speaking out as soon as possible on the situation in Syria, sending a positive signal of commitment to resolving the Syrian issue and reflecting its important role. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that as a strategic partner of the countries of the Middle East, China is ready to work with the international community to continue to make unremitting efforts to promote long-term stability in Syria and the restoration of peace and tranquility in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and USG Tom Fletcher for their comprehensive briefings. I also thank Ms. Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamus for sharing their personal stories and insightful observations. After 13 years of devastating civil war, Syria has demonstrated that the Syrian-led political transition, once dismissed by some as a hollow ambition, is now proving to be an achievable goal. However, how we navigate this transformative juncture will determine whether Syria can rebuild itself as a legitimate state for all Syrians. Let me highlight the following points in this regard. First, the caretaker government should ensure a peaceful power transition through a political process based on the principles enshrined in Resolution 2254. The keys here are legitimacy and inclusiveness. We note the Prime Minister's statement that his term will last until March 1st of next year. His emphasis on the caretaker mandate's temporary nature is a good start, and we look forward to a peaceful, free, and fair elections as early as practicable. Sustainable governance for Syria, a multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian state, inherently requires inclusivity. No community or group, including ethnic or religious minorities and women, should be excluded. In this regard, we note with deep interest the caretaker government's commitment to social reconciliation and cohesion among all communities, and we look forward to seeing these commitments translated into tangible actions. Second, all hostilities throughout the country must cease in order to stabilize Syria and safeguard its territorial integrity at this critical juncture. Especially, intensified hostilities in northern Syria, Golan incursions, and Israel's airstrikes across the country are deeply concerning. Even more disturbing is Israel's plan to expand its settlement in the occupied Golan Heights, contrary to its obligations under the Geneva Conventions and the Security Council Resolution 497. Exploiting Syria's turmoil for territorial gain is unacceptable. All parties must respect relevant agreements, including the 1974 disengagement agreement and the last week's SNA-SDF ceasefire agreement. Third, Syria's deteriorating humanitarian situation should be urgently addressed. Pressing challenges, including winterization needs and large population flows in the wake of the sudden downfall of Assad, call for swift and enhanced international assistance on the ground. For its part, the Republic of Korea contributed $26 million to mitigate suffering of Syrians this year so far. Meanwhile, indications of revitalizing economic activity and the resumption of public services require a fresh approach to help this transition. Jobs, clean water, education, healthcare, and public safety are all critical for uniting communities, rebuilding the nation, and laying the foundation for the voluntary return of Syrian refugees. In this regard, we welcome the early recovery strategy announced by OCHA last month and look forward to its effective implementation, not only addressing the imminent humanitarian crisis, but also fostering long-term resilience. Fourth, justice and reconciliation must anchor Syria's new political order. Colombia's experience over the last decade illustrates the complexities of implementing inclusive transitional justice and underscores the absolute necessity of such efforts for enduring peace. In this vein, we keenly note the caretaker government's amnesty decree for conscripted soldiers, while at the same time proclaiming that it will prosecute war criminals. In this connection, ongoing actions to clarify the fate of missing persons are critical. While the liberation of Sednaya prison is an extremely painful reminder of the Assad regime's barbaric brutality, more than 100,000 missing persons remain tragically unaccounted for. As the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria, IIMP, emphasized in its statement last week, all parties on the ground must submit any relevant information to the IIMP to help clarify the fate and the whereabouts of the missing Syrians. Last but not least, transitional authorities must fully cooperate with the OPCW to ensure accountability for Syria's past use of chemical weapons, a long-standing expectation of this Council. At the same time, substantial quantities of chemical weapons remain unaccounted for, posing grave risks to regional security, particularly amid the current power vacuum. We note with expectation the caretaker government's expressed willingness to collaborate with the OPCW and urge it to strictly honor its own commitment. Meanwhile, we note the OPCW Director General's remark that airstrikes targeting facilities not only bear the risk of contamination, but also jeopardize the destruction of valuable evidence for investigations related to past use of chemical weapons. Madam President, in conclusion, the Republic of Korea hopes this historic positive momentum should not only be preserved, but also fortified, so that the Syrian people can reclaim their future. Let us stand united for a dignified, stable, and peaceful future for all Syrians, underpinned with basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. At the beginning, I'd like to express our gratitude to both briefers, as well as to Ms. Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamous for the valuable contributions. Special Envoy Pedersen, my country greatly appreciated your voice after the fall of the Assad regime, as well as your engagement with the caretaker authorities in the days that followed. Madam President, colleagues, the transfer of power in Syria carries profound emotional weight for the nation that has endured years of conflict, years of loss and fractured unity. For many, the idea of change is both a beacon of hope and a source of anxiety. It symbolizes the possibility of healing a war-torn country and a rebuilding of a future rooted in dignity and justice. Yet it also brings deep fears of continued instability, reprisals, and the resurfacing of old wounds. Today, Syrians find themselves at a crossroad, entering uncharted waters filled with hope. Hope that their legitimate aspirations to live a life in peace, freedom, and prosperity could be realized at last. In this regard, Madam President, I'd like to make the following remarks. First, prosperous future depends on a credible and inclusive political transition, an inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, which should take place in line with the key principles of the Resolution 2254. In this regard, I'd like to emphasize that women must be able to participate fully, safely, and meaningfully in all processes. While doing so, Syria must abide by all relevant resolutions of the Council. We're especially stressing all parties' obligations related to the fight against terrorism. In particular, we'd like to underscore the importance of preventing the Islamic State and other groups from re-establishing their capabilities and denying them safe haven in Syria. The caretaker authorities must also respect Syria's other international obligations, including the Chemical Weapons Convention. Second, years of hostilities across all of Syria have exacerbated humanitarian needs. We join others in urging for additional international support for the efforts of the United Nations and humanitarian organizations to surge humanitarian aid to support civilians in need across Syria. We expect the caretaker authorities to hold true to their commitments of ensuring full humanitarian access and the continuity of essential services. All efforts should be accompanied by preventing further displacement and disruption of humanitarian access. Third, we call upon all states to ensure all those responsible for the crimes committed are held accountable. It is equally important that evidence of atrocities is preserved and documented. We call on all parties to cooperate fully with the independent institutions of missing persons, which we hope will be operational as soon as possible, the international, impartial, and independent mechanism, and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. Survivors, victims, and their loved ones deserve justice, truth, and reparations. Accounting for the missing and ensuring that families receive the clarity and recognition they desperately need should be a priority. Sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity of Syria are imperative. We echo Secretary General's concern about the recent extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. There is no way around the 1974 disengagement agreement, including the principles regarding the area of separation that must be fully respected and implemented. Slovenia fully supports UNDOF and the implementation of its mandate. Madam President, the people of Syria deserve justice, peace, and stability, but they also deserve much more. After more than 50 years of the rule of the Assad family, they deserve a peace of mind that history will not repeat itself. The change that this transition brings should not only shift Syria away from the violent conflict, but also from the decades of repression and atrocities. Actions by the de facto authorities showing full respect for international humanitarian and human rights law would be an indispensable first step in this direction. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank Special Envoy Peterson, ERC Fletcher, Ms. Al-Khattab, and Brother James for their updates today. After nearly 14 years of brutal conflict, which culminated in the collapse of the Assad regime, the Syrian people can finally hope again. Malta extends its heartfelt support to Syrians all over the world as they celebrate this remarkable development. Over the past 2 years, Malta has called on all parties, including representatives of the former regime, to engage in the Constitutional Committee. We implored the need for inclusive reform, elections, transitional processes, and genuine accountability in shaping a new Syria. Regrettably, the Assad regime declined and instead imposed years of anguish on the Syrian people. Political prisoners languished in secret detention and torture facilities. Humanitarian aid was subverted and withheld. Millions were displaced and made refugees. President, in our first statement to the Council, we reflected on the acute humanitarian needs across Syria, the economic crisis, major food insecurity, and the lack of medical staff, drugs, and safe facilities. We addressed the cholera outbreak and the importance of the humanitarian cross-border mechanism. We bore witness to the extension of the Council's mandate to allow cross-border aid into Syria, the eventual veto, and the transition to a direct agreement between Damascus and the UN. Regrettably, the humanitarian needs remain as significant now as they were when we first took our seat on the Council. Now, with the humanitarian access being at its greatest point in comparison to any other time during the conflict, greater resourcing and attention to early recovery, resilience, and livelihoods programs is vital. In this regard, we also take note of the commitments made by the interim government to enable and protect UN and humanitarian staff and operations. Across the country, land must be cleared for planting. Farmers must have access to irrigation systems, tools, and seeds to prepare for next year's harvest. After so much destruction, our collective focus now must be to rebuild. President, Malta stresses in the strongest terms the importance of an orderly, peaceful, and inclusive political transition. While there has been cause for great optimism, significant concerns remain regarding reprisal attacks and the backslide into autocratic and radical governance. First, the rights of women and all minorities, including religious minorities, must be ensured. This is the foundation upon which Syria can rebuild and emerge from the rubble. Second, continued progress towards a stable interim government is key. From there, re-engagement with Resolution 2254 presents a credible roadmap for a new, inclusive political horizon. It provides a path where all Syrian stakeholders, including civil society, can engage to positively transform Syrian society and unlock the political support of the international community for rebuilding efforts. Third, the continued presence and operations of UNDOF, especially at this time of grave instability, cannot be underestimated. We remain strongly supportive of UNDOF and full compliance with the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. The illegal seizure of Syrian territory is unacceptable and risks reigniting the flames of conflict. Syria's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. Fourth, justice and accountability are the basis of any lasting peace. The scenes we witnessed last week from the Sednaya prison are horrifying. We must tread carefully and work systematically to reunite families with detained loved ones where possible. We must equally continue to establish the fate of the missing and those who will never return. In this respect, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic are more critical than ever. President, from the very start of our term, we pledge to be guided by the needs of the Syrian people. At this historic juncture, we stand by Syrians at home and throughout the world as they reclaim their country, sovereignty, and dignity. We remain committed to healing wounds and bridging divides in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Under-Secretary General Fletcher for their briefings. I also thank Dr. Jamous and Ms. Al-Khatib for their very powerful briefings on the next steps needed for Syria. Colleagues, this is a moment of hope and a new chapter for the Syrian people. They suffered enormously under the Assad regime's cruel grip. It is a moment to mourn and seek accountability for those who've been lost, and a chance to ensure that the nation handed down to future generations is one built on democracy, stability, and peaceful coexistence. I will focus on 3 points addressing the transition period, humanitarian support, and accountability. First, the transition period. We cannot underestimate the challenge ahead. The UK, alongside the UN and our Arab, US, and EU partners, has been clear that the Syrian people have our full support as they proceed with the momentous task of building their future. We call on the new interim authorities to support an inclusive political dialogue on Syria's future governance, protect the rights of all individuals, respect international humanitarian law, and develop a process of equitable justice and accountability. We will judge them by their actions. The world is watching. Of course, the fall of Assad does not mean that security in Syria will automatically improve. We must remain seized of the threat of a Daesh resurgence. The UK is fully committed to supporting Syria's fight against terrorism. Respect for Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity is crucial for the peace and security of the region. We call on all parties to cease hostilities in Syria. Second, humanitarian support. This is an opportunity to end the suffering that Syrians have endured for far too long. We welcome the positive engagement that the Emergency Relief Coordinator has had in Syria with the new interim authorities. We have seen millions of Syrians displaced from their homes without proper access to food, medicine, basic services, or an education for their children. For those returning home and seeking to rebuild their lives, the international community must stand together to support their immediate needs. In the past week, the UK has announced an additional $78 million aid package to support the most vulnerable Syrians, including Syrian refugees across the region. Third, accountability. we stand with the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who were arbitrarily detained, tortured, and murdered at the hands of the regime. We also remember the men, women, and children of Ghouta, Douma, and Khan Sheikhoun, victims of Assad's horrific use of chemical weapons. We, the international community, must continue to pursue accountability for these atrocities, including the preservation of records alongside full implementation of Resolution 2118. The UK has provided a further $150,000 to the OPCW Syria missions to help rid Syria of its chemical weapons stockpile once and for all. President, as we look to 2025 and beyond, we call on the international community to come together and support Syria as it seeks the future it has waited for, the future it has fought for, and the future it deserves. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. Thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Undersecretary General Fletcher, for your briefings and also for your recommendations. And thank you, Badr Jamous and Wad Al-Khattab, for your powerful statements and your relentless efforts to advance peace and security in Syria for the Syrian people. Colleagues, at long last, the Assad regime has fallen, and the Syrian people are seeing their first glimpse of freedom in decades and are experiencing their first glimmer of hope. That includes thousands of political prisoners who have spent years and years locked away by the regime. Syrians like Qasim Sobi El-Kabalani, who shared his story with the BBC last week. Qasim was arrested by the regime in 2016 and eventually sent to Saadnaya, to the prison which has been described as a human slaughterhouse. There he was subject to unthinkable horrors, including torture. And after so much abuse, it was nearly impossible for him to imagine his release. But now Qasim is free and feels like he has been granted a new lease on life. Colleagues, all of Syria has a chance for a new beginning. This is a historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better life. After more than a decade of conflict and corruption, their needs are extensive, and the United States is committed to mobilizing global support. Last week, Secretary Blinken, together with our partners in the Aqaba Joint Contact Group, announced a set of principles that will help guide international efforts to support the Syrian people as they write their next chapter. And let me be clear, it is theirs to write. It would be a waste of this historic opportunity if one tyrant were toppled only to see a new one rise up in his place. Therefore, we fully support a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition in which the spirit of Resolution 2254 that will lead to credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian governance for the benefit of all Syrians, as we heard stated by Mr. Pedersen earlier today. Together with our partners, we will engage with Syrian groups to support an independent and sovereign Syria that respects human rights, including the rights of minorities and women, and that upholds international humanitarian law. The U.S. and our partners also agreed that Syrian state institutions should deliver essential services to its people. Colleagues, in recent days, we have seen the emotional scenes of missing and disappeared family members being reunited with their loved ones. Determining the fate of missing Syrians and foreign nationals is of vital importance, because while Qasim and thousands of others are now free, so many families are still in the dark. That includes the loved ones of U.S. citizen Austin Tice, who was taken captive more than 12 years ago. We will not rest until Austin is home, and we are pressing all parties in Syria to help make this happen. The United States appreciates the work of civil society groups, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, and Commission of Inquiry, which continue to document regime violations and abuses. As the independent institution on missing persons, mission has never been more crucial. We encourage the Secretary General to appoint a head of the IIMP as soon as possible. Our support and funding of this work must continue. Colleagues, the regime may have fallen, but the dire humanitarian needs of millions of Syrians remain, as you've heard from all of our speakers today. In addition to ensuring unhindered access from neighboring countries and throughout Syria, we call for additional financial support for UN agencies and aid organizations. This includes additional contributions to the Syria Recovery Trust Fund. I've often spoken about the Syrians forced to flee the violence and destruction of the regime. Now so many refugees are eager to return home and help rebuild their country. Many displaced Syrians in host countries still require protection and basic services. Indeed, some Syrian refugees and asylum seekers may be even more vulnerable. And so all states must uphold their obligations to refugees. Colleagues, just as Syria's leaders should no longer pose a threat to their own people, Syria should have peaceful relations with its neighbors. The United States will continue to support Syria's neighbors, including Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, and Israel, should any new threats arise from Syria during this period of transition. Preventing these threats requires that Syria cooperates with efforts to secure and destroy its remaining chemical weapons stockpiles. Consistent with its obligation under the Chemical Weapons Convention and Security Council Resolution 2118. We seek assurances of Syria's commitment to cooperate with the OPCW in this regard. Finally, there is a strong international consensus that Syria must not be used as base for terrorists such as ISIS. That requires securing detention facilities and displaced persons camps in northeast Syria, which hold nearly 9,000 ISIS fighters. And that means continuing to repatriate detained and displaced foreign nationals. As the United States maintains our mission against ISIS, there should be no doubt we will fully defend and protect U.S. personnel and U.S. military positions in northeast Syria. Colleagues, for so long, it might have seemed that Assad's violent, repressive tactics would pay off, that his grip on power was unshakable, especially since Russia did everything in its power to prop up Assad's brutal regime. And unlike what we heard the Russian PR say about supporting the Syrian people, Russia actually targeted Syrian civilians. Russia obstructed cross-border humanitarian assistance, and now Russia is offering safe haven to Syria's deposed dictator. But Russia's and Assad's campaign of cruelty ultimately failed. The regime has fallen, and Syria has a chance for a new beginning. Going forward, we must demonstrate the Council's unity in support of the Syrian people. For even as we are clear-eyed about the challenges ahead, we are determined to stand with the Syrian people. We are determined to stand with the Syrian people as they write what we hope will be a peaceful, prosperous next chapter. Thank you very much. I resume resume my function as President of the Council. And I now give the floor to the representative of Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful, we thank Mr. Peterson, the Special Envoy, and Mr. Fletcher and the Secretary General for their insightful briefings. We listened carefully to a statement made by the other briefers. Regarding the recent development in Syria, I would like to make the following key points. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran reaffirms its unwavering support for Syrians' unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The future of Syria must be decided solely by its people, free from external interference or imposition. An inclusive Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the UN and grounded in the framework of the Resolution 2254 is essential. This includes drafting a new constitution through a representative constitutional committee and establish an inclusive and representative government that reflects the aspiration of all Syrian people. In this context, Iran commends the constructive effort and active engagement of the UN Special Envoy, Mr. Peterson, in advancing this critical objective. Second, maintaining Syrian governmental institutions is vital for stability and the foundation of an inclusive political solution. Institutional collapse risks further fragmentation, humanitarian suffering, and exploitation by extremists. Lessons from the past conflict underline the importance of institutional continuity for basic services, the rule of law, and trust building. The international community must support Syria's institutional resilience, respecting its sovereignty and the will of its people. Third, the safety of all Syrian citizens, including the rights of minorities as well as foreign nationals, must be ensured. Religious and cultural sites and places must be safeguarded, and the inavailability of diplomatic premises and personnel must be upheld in accordance with international law. Fourth, Iran strongly condemns Israel's continued violation of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Israeli occupying regime has exploited the current situation in Syria to pursue its political agenda and further destroy Syria's infrastructure. The Security Council must take decisive action to address this aggression and to put an end to Israeli occupation of Syrian territory, which constitute a blatant violation of international law, the UN Charter, and the Council's own resolution, in particular Resolution 350. Iran reaffirms its unwavering support for UNDOF and the full implementation of its mandate. Fifth, the Syrian people face immense economic and humanitarian hardship that demand urgent action. Rebuilding critical infrastructure, restoring services, and ensuring the safe return of refugees and internally displaced persons are essential for fostering national unity and recovery. Immediate aid must be prioritized and unilateral sanctions on Syria must be lifted. The continuation of these inhuman and illegal measures is unjustifiable, as they disproportionately harm the most vulnerable, worsen economic hardship, and violate the fundamental rights of the Syrian people. Iran commends the tireless efforts of OCHA and its humanitarian partners in their work toward alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people. Sixth, Syria remains a pivotal country in the region and must recover its vital role in promoting peace and stability, free from terrorism that poses no threat to its neighbors or the broader region. The Syrian people deserve peace, dignity, and the chance to rebuild their nation free from external interference. The international community must collectively support Syria's unity, sovereignty, and reconstruction, ensuring the rights of aspiration of all Syrians are upheld. Seventh, Iran has consistently played a pivotal and constructive role in promoting regional peace and security, paying a heavy price both in material and human cost in fight against terrorism in Syria and the wider region. This undeniable reality cannot be overlooked. For years, Iran has provided legitimate support to Syria in its fight against terrorism, acting upon the formal and unlawful request of the then Syrian government. Without Iran and the Hezbollah decisive efforts and sacrifices, Syria would have fallen entirely under the control of Daesh and its affiliated terrorist groups, with their influence potentially extending into Lebanon. These efforts also played a critical role in bringing to end to Daesh control in both Iraq and Syria. Finally, Iran and Syria share deep historical and friendly relations, which continue to grow based on mutual interest and international legal principles. Iran remains steadfast in its constructive role working with the United Nations, regional partners, and the Syrian people to achieve lasting peace and stability in Syria and the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
شكرا جزيلا السيد الرئيس على
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for convening this meeting to discuss the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We would like to thank the Council and the Secretary General for their efforts to continue developments in Syria to support Syria and in the Syrian crisis that has caused so much suffering for the Syrian people over the last few years, and this based on our humanitarian and regional responsibility to support efforts to restore peace and stability in Syria and across the region. We would like to thank Mr. Pedersen, the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mr. Fletcher, the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. We thank them for their briefings. Likewise, we listened closely to the statements by Mr. Mohammed Al-Khatib and Mr. Jamous. Since the beginning of the Syrian crisis in 2011, Iraq has continued to call for a political dialogue between all of the Syrian parties. This is the only way to resolve this crisis. We believe that a political solution must be based on the willingness of the Syrian people and must be Syrian-led without any foreign interference. Further, we are aware that only the Syrian people has the right to decide on its own future and to choose its leaders through a democratic process that reflects the aspirations of the Syrian people and which ensures its rights, freedoms, and we reaffirm that the stability of Syria is an integral part of the stability of the region. Therefore, we call on the international community to step up its efforts to assist the Syrian people in overcoming this test by providing humanitarian assistance or participating in reconstruction. Any solution to address the repercussions of the regime change must be based on a constructive dialogue in order to ensure that there is a political, economic, and humanitarian response that is not suffer any foreign interference. We would like to reaffirm the following points. Firstly, it's important to respect the willingness of the Syrian people and its right to decide on its future freely without any foreign interference. We must ensure its right to decide on its leaders following the regime change in Syria. The current juncture calls for a balanced, comprehensive approach to achieve peace and stability in Syria after so many years of conflict. We call for support for the Syrian people in all of its component parts through an inclusive approach that takes into account all of the parts of Syrian society without any exclusiveness. We must ensure peaceful coexistence between all of these component parts of the Syrian population to ensure that they are represented with rights for respect for human rights and women's rights. We must further seek to achieve a stable and prosperous state. Secondly, we must support inclusive, fair political regime based on particularly Resolution 2054 of the Security Council to guarantee a peaceful political transition in line with the aspirations of the Syrian people. We must also develop a clear roadmap to ensure a peaceful political process, ensuring the effective involvement of all Syrian forces and to strengthen the Syrian state institutions. Thirdly, we must preserve the unity of the Syrian people, the unity of the country and its territorial integrity. We reject any attempt to divide Syria, violate its sovereignty, or establish hotbeds of influence subject to regional actors. This would destabilize Syria and the region. We must further ensure that Syria will be united and sovereign and will benefit from the unity of its territory. We further call on all Syrian stakeholders to overcome their divisions and to work together to create a political regime reflecting the aspirations of the Syrian people across all of its component parts. We must address the humanitarian situation and improve the humanitarian situation of the Syrian people by providing the necessary humanitarian aid, by supporting their reconstruction and bringing an end to the isolation of Syria, and ensure that they can return home safely and in dignity. We must ensure safety with regard to their return. We also recall the importance of international and regional cooperation to combat terrorism, which remains a threat to Syria and the region. Syria must not be transformed into a haven for terrorist organizations or a crossing point for terrorist organizations. We are very concerned by the increasing threat of terrorist organizations in Syria and the region because they take advantage of the lack of peace and stability to expand their scope of influence. This has a direct effect on neighboring countries. We must also support the efforts of the Special Envoy, and we call on all to support the efforts of the Special Envoy to ensure that we can comply with Resolution 2254. We further call for strengthened United Nations presence on the ground. The Republic of Iraq condemns and firmly denounces the decision by the Israeli entity to expand its settlement building in the occupied Syrian Golan. This represents a serious violation of international law and the international resolutions. We reiterate our unchanged position and the right of the Syrian people to its sovereignty across all of its territory. The Golan is an occupied Syrian territory. Any attempts to change its demographic makeup is null and void. We also call on the international community to work seriously to preserve the unity and sovereignty of Syria and to achieve peace and stability across the region. We call on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility to take the necessary steps to bring an end to these violations, which are benefiting from the current situation in Syria. We reaffirm that it's important to respect the Disengagement of Forces Agreement of 1974 and to ensure the continued presence of UNDOF on the ground. UNDOF plays an essential role to preserve stability and ensuring de-escalation in the region. In conclusion, we remain ready to work with all parties in the region to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and to ensure a dignified future for its people. We call for pooled international efforts to support Syria and its people during this stage and to overcome political, human, and security challenges. We stand ready to cooperate with all parties to achieve this noble aim, and we urge all Syrian stakeholders to overcome their differences and to work together to build a political regime reflecting the aspirations of the Syrian people in all of its component parts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Iraq for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. I am also grateful to Special Envoy Pedersen and the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Fletcher, for their briefings, as well as Mr. Jamuz, Chairman of the Syrian Negotiations Commission, and Ms. El-Khatib for their interventions. And I really congratulate them for conveying voice of their people during these hardship 14 years to the international community. The Syrian people are at a pivotal moment in their history. As of December 8, Syria entered a new era, one that carries the potential to transform a decade of conflict and suffering into a future marked by peace, stability, and prosperity. After 14 years of unimaginable pain, the Syrian people are closer than ever to realizing their aspiration for a free and inclusive Syria. However, the road ahead is not without its challenges. The next steps should be critical to rebuild a Syria that is united, inclusive, and stable, a Syria that can contribute to the stability of our entire region. Madam President, the primary responsibility for this transition rests with the Syrian people themselves. Their ownership of this process is paramount. And as a diplomat, Turkish diplomat who served in Damascus before, I am very confident on this. A credible and legitimate transition, a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process will require bold, inclusive, and determined steps towards national unity. Inclusivity must lie at the heart of Syria's future. A new Syrian government must reflect the voices of all segments of society. This is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic necessity. Only an inclusive and representative political framework can foster the long-term harmony required to build a united Syria. Equally, the territorial integrity of Syria must be safeguarded under all circumstances. The fragmentation of Syria would not only jeopardize the country's future, but also destabilize an already fragile region. A united Syria must emerge as a place where all its people can coexist peacefully without fear of sectarian strife or discrimination. Respect for all segments of society and the rejection of sectarianism must remain guiding principles. Madam President, for over a decade, Turkey has stood by the Syrian people, offering unwavering support to both those within Syria and the millions forced to seek refuge beyond the borders. Turkey has hosted 4 million Syrians, providing them with safety, education, and livelihoods. This is not just a testament to Turkey's solidarity, but also a recognition that Syria's stability is critical for the stability of the region. The international community must now match this commitment. The devastation brought by years of conflict cannot be overcome by Syrians alone. We need swift actions in the political and humanitarian fields. The matter of sanctions needs to be addressed. This is essential for a self-sustained, functioning state. A comprehensive recovery plan, supported by international assistance and resources, is urgently needed to alleviate suffering, rebuild the infrastructure, and create conditions for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of millions of displaced Syrians. Turkey, for its part, has already reactivated its embassy in Damascus as a step toward fostering a constructive dialogue during this transition. Madam President, stability in Syria cannot be achieved without addressing the persistent threat of terrorism. Syria must not become a haven for terrorist groups that exploit the transition period to further their agenda. In particular, PKK, YPG, and the so-called SDF and its affiliates remain a grave threat not only to Syria's unity and security, but also to Turkey's national security and the broader region. Their attacks, including those targeting Arab-majority regions, such as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, highlight the urgency of eradicating these groups to ensure the safety of all Syrians. While the transitional process must be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, it cannot include actors like PKK, YPG, SDF, whose actions undermine Syrians' territorial integrity and stability. Turkey will continue to take preventive measures to protect its borders and prevent these groups from exploiting the situation on the ground. Madam President, Turkey remains deeply committed to Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and prosperity. Israel's ongoing actions and attacks seriously undermine the efforts to bring stability in Syria. These illegal actions and attacks cannot be explained by any legitimate security concern and unacceptable. So this Council should react accordingly. Over the years, we have actively engaged in dialogue with regional and international partners, including through recent meetings in Doha and Aqaba, to ensure that the national reconciliation and the transitional process aligns with the principles of inclusivity and stability. Finally, the international community must not turn a blind eye to the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, exemplified by the horrific images emerging from Sidnaya prison and the Damascus region. Justice and accountability are essential to healing the wounds of the Syrian people and ensuring that such crimes are never repeated. At this critical juncture, let us recommit to standing with the Syrian people in their pursuit of a free, inclusive, and united Syria, one that will serve as a pillar of stability for the entire region. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussions on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.